Hey guys, tonight we time-slip barefoot into a land of silt and sweat, into a world so old the alphabet hasn't even been invented yet. The Tigris murmurs to your left, the Euphrates hums to your right, and between them lies a sticky cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia. You're not strolling through some dusty museum display, no. You're trudging past crumbling mudbrick temples, where torchlight flickers against the slick skin of priestesses locked in sacred embrace. You hear them before you see them, soft sighs behind woven curtains, bodies draped in linen thin enough to melt into shadow. And here's your first little shock. This isn't some underground sex cult. This is civic duty. This is city planning. Welcome to the only place in human history where your orgasm could literally fund a dam. Where sex was not sin, it was salvation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into Uruk, 4000 BCE, and the air hits you like a steam bath, thick, musky, and somehow metallic. It smells like wet clay, goat sweat, old incense, and sex. A lot of sex. Not the kind scribbled in bathroom stalls or whispered on third dates, but high stakes, divine, earth-breathing sex. Sex that makes the grain grow. Sex that decides whether your mudbrick house survives the flood season. Sex that builds cities. And not just metaphorically. You walk past a ziggurat towering like a wedding cake, sculpted by God's high-on ego, and you realize every brick, every stone, was made possible because someone got laid for it. Not in secret, not in shame, but in public ritual, in the name of Inanna, goddess of love, war, and boundary-crossing chaos. She is everywhere here, her symbol carved into doorposts, her name murmured before harvest, her statues crowned in lapis, lazuli, and erotic poetry. Now, here's your first historical whiplash. In Mesopotamia, a city was a womb. And not just poetically. The city was a womb. It had gates called thighs, temples as uteruses, roads that were veins, and sacred sex that seeded its vitality. The king didn't just rule by law, he ruled by stamina. Every new year, he had to reenact the divine wedding of Dumuzi and Inanna, complete with full throttle, watched by everyone, ritual lovemaking. If he did it right, if he made the goddess moan just long enough, the rivers would flood just enough, the crops would root just deep enough, and the people would sigh in grain-fed satisfaction. If he failed, famine, disease, revolt, you probably wouldn't survive this. You duck under a linen canopy and find yourself in a temple brothel, not a red light district, but a holy site. The priestesses here are not for sale, and they don't take your silver. They take your fertility, your intention, your sacred groveling. The ritual goes like this. You offer grain, she anoints your head with perfumed oil. You lie down on ceremonial mats embroidered with crescent moons. And together, you perform what's called hieros gamos, the sacred marriage. But you're not just doing it, you're becoming a conduit. You're mimicking what the gods did when they shaped civilization from mud and moans. And her pleasure? It isn't optional, it's the point. The moaning of the priestess is believed to activate the earth. The sound travels through stone, into soil, into seed. One fringe Babylonian tablet even suggests that louder moans correlate with higher barley yields, though historians still argue whether this was meant literally, metaphorically, or just wishful thinking by ancient farmers. You pass a wall inscribed with one of Inanna's hymns' delicate cuneiform strokes that curl like hips in motion. It reads like erotica meets irrigation manual. She speaks of his milk sweet as date wine, and plowing her field until the stars collapse. This wasn't porn. This was prophecy. A city that didn't engage in these rites was a city that would crumble. No moaning equals no mourning. You glance at the temple foundation, and here's a quirky tidbit for you. Archaeologists once found crushed rose petals embedded in the stone. Not symbolic carvings, actual petals, preserved by heat and weight. It's like someone scattered them during a ceremony, and they were pressed into permanence by time and footfall. A literal floral memory of a night where sex built cities. And just to keep your eyebrows raised, let's pivot to a story Michel Foucault dissected in his Spiral of Thoughts on Sex and Power. He traced how sexual rituals weren't just expressions of pleasure, but mechanisms of control. In Mesopotamia, sex was surveillance. You weren't just being watched, you were performing for the gods, the king, the scribes, and the collective future. And that performance echoed through policy, irrigation, urban design. They didn't separate desire from discipline. They laced them together like wet reeds in a basket. You walk through the temple's back exit, stepping over worn stones shaped by 1,000 bare feet and 1,000 whispered prayers. The moon's up now, fat and watchful, and the scent of juniper smoke wraps around you like an ancient lullaby. Somewhere nearby, a priestess still sings to Inanna, her voice drifting into the dark like the last breath of a love spell. You don't know if you're aroused, enlightened, or just very, very confused. That's okay. You've just taken your first step into a world where sex isn't a private act, it's a civic engine. And baby, that city's only just begun to. You follow the stone path deeper into the temple district, where every wall hums with meaning, and every breeze feels like a god's exhale. In the torchlight, you glimpse a frieze carved into limestone, Inanna astride a lion, her hands outstretched, holding twin rods of justice in one fist and a cluster of ripe figs in the other. This is not your average love goddess. She's not lounging on a cloud tossing roses like a bored influencer. No, she's fierce, strategic, political, and deeply, unapologetically carnal. And her thighs are legend. In the myths, she opens them not just to lovers, but to entire cities, inviting prosperity through sacred lust. You blink, and the carving seems to move. Her eyes catch yours, and for a moment, you understand why ancient builders took her so seriously. To please her was to stabilize the state. To disappoint her was to risk everything. Inanna's story isn't just spiritual, it's logistical. Take the myth of her sacred marriage to Dumuzi, the shepherd god. It wasn't just pillow talk, it was a literal state ceremony. Each spring, the king of the city would play Dumuzi, while a high priestess played Inanna. In a carefully orchestrated rite, they'd reenact the divine coupling before the eyes of the elite and the ears of the gods. But this wasn't just about symbolic sex, it was an urban blueprint. The joining of divine masculine and feminine represented the balance between wild and tamed, animal and domestic, nature and structure. Their climax marked the moment when chaos was transformed into order, when reeds became bricks, and bricks became homes. One Mesopotamian poem describes Inanna urging Dumuzi to plow her wet furrow, a line that sounds risk until you realize it's also a pun on irrigation, agriculture, and civic fertility. This is what made Mesopotamian theology so weirdly genius. Everything was layered. Every moan was metaphor. Every kiss was construction code. Here's a sexy detail scholars love to argue about. During these ceremonies, was the sex actual or symbolic? Some say the priestess and king really did it, with full ceremony and full audience. Others insist it was more theatrical gestures, poetry, music, and enough perfume to knock out a donkey. The debate's been raging since the first clay tablets were dug out of the sand. But the real power lies in how seriously they took it. Whether real or symbolic, the people believed it worked. They believed it summoned rain, stabilized trade routes, soothed war gods. It was urban planning with an erotic twist. Now you step into a smaller chamber, quiet, cool, scented faintly of old cedar and something sweet. On a low altar lies a statue of Dumuzi, carved in alabaster, with eyes that once glittered with lapis and a smile. That's way too smug for someone who gets sacrificed every summer. Because yes, there's a twist. After their sacred union, Dumuzi doesn't get to lounge forever in marital bliss. Instead, he's dragged to the underworld as a stand-in for Inanna, who pulled a fast one to escape death. It's the original bait-and-switch relationship move. In Nith, Dumuzi's descent represents the drying of the land, the dying of crops, the end of sexual abundance. But here's the kicker. Even in his death, Dumuzi's passion sustains the city. His groans echo underground. His longing fertilizes the roots of grain, and when he's resurrected each year, the city blooms with him. It's tragic. It's romantic. It's urban myth used as water management policy. Over in a dusty archive room, you find a clay tablet half-cracked but still legible. It's a hymn to Inanna, but it reads like a lover's dirty text message filtered through a cosmic lens. She boasts, "I lifted his head and poured my nectar into him. He stood firm as a tamarisk tree." You want to giggle, but then you realize this was serious business. This was theology. This was statcraft. They saw no contradiction between divine language and erotic metaphor. They weren't embarrassed. They were efficient. Sex wasn't a distraction from the work of empire. It was the work of empire. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe ziggurats, the massive step temples, were designed to mimic the body of a reclining goddess. The base was her thighs, the top her head. Every step, a metaphor for ascending into union with the divine. The king's climb to the summit wasn't just a priestly obligation, it was foreplay for the cosmos. When he entered the sacred chamber, he was stepping into her body. When he emerged, he was reborn, not just as ruler, but as literal partner of the gods. No pressure, right? Back outside, you hear the city breathe, vendors wrapping up, donkeys braying in the distance, and the soft clink of ceramic cups being rinsed in river water. Somewhere, a scribe is composing a new poem about Inanna's hips and the curve of her temple arches. You realize now that for the Mesopotamians, love and architecture weren't separate categories. They overlapped, like silk on skin. A building was only sacred if it was erotic. A city was only alive if it moaned with the gods. You keep moving through the dusk-thick city, past incense-stained alleyways and crumbling altars where yesterday's offerings still reek of dried dates and goat fat. As the temple ziggurat fades behind you, you start noticing something odd. There are no clear lines between the sacred and the profane. The fish seller calls his stall Inanna's gift. The wine merchant's jugs are etched with love spells. And tucked between every fifth grain shop is something even more fascinating. A brothel. But not the kind you're picturing. There are no garish curtains, no shameful alley entrances, no blinking signs. Instead, these places are tidy, tiled, almost official looking, as if the city itself filed them under public services. Because here's the twist. In ancient Mesopotamia, sex workers weren't marginalized, they were institutional, embedded, respected even. Some were priestesses, others were civil agents. And yes, some were taxed. Bureaucracy in bedroom? Total overlap. You enter one of these brothels, a narrow building with high, slitted windows and a central courtyard draped in linen. The walls are painted with faded murals. Men with coal-lined eyes lounging beside women pouring wine, all surrounded by fruit, birds, and symbols of the gods. A scribe at the front desk. Yes, there's a desk catalogs transactions not in coin, but in offerings, a jug of beer, 2 loaves of bread, a bolt of wool. Every encounter is recorded on clay, with the meticulousness of a tax ledger. And here's where it gets deliciously weird. Some sex workers worked for the temple. Their acts weren't just intimate, they were divine contracts. The pleasure exchanged here was thought to appease the gods, keep river levels balanced, and prevent civic unrest. You might chuckle, but it's no stranger than modern people believing a single vote can shift history. For the Mesopotamians, a well-performed sacred act could literally anchor the economy. Let's pause for one juicy historical nugget. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman recounts a case where high-status Mesopotamian concubines trained for years not just in physical arts, but in law, politics, and ritual. Some were assigned to powerful men, not merely for pleasure, but to gather intelligence, soothe tempers, or subtly influence decisions through pillow speak. One particular priestess named Ninsun, yes, that's her real name, was so influential in Yor's temple system that kings sought her favors as a form of diplomatic alliance. She wasn't just betting leaders. She was shaping trade agreements while sipping fig wine and stroking a lyre. So much for sex being just recreation. Outside again, you pass a tax station, an open-air stall where scribes tally fish deliveries and wool bales. But just to the left, a separate scribe keeps track of sexual offerings. These aren't bribes or fines. They're ritual payments. A farmer, having recently harvested a strong barley crop, donates a portion of his yield in thanks for the temple rites performed on his behalf the month prior. He believes the fertility of his land is tied to the fertility enacted on the ceremonial mats of the temple. And who's to say he's wrong? In an age where every raindrop is a miracle and every flood a death threat, sex becomes more than pleasure. It becomes policy. Now for a quirky fringe theory. Some historians suggest that certain brothels operated as early forms of census offices, not because people were counted during the act, but because these institutions kept such detailed records. Name, offering, time of visit, even fertility status. Over time, the scribes here may have compiled demographic data more complete than any city official ever could. Imagine that the world's first data centers run by women who also happen to know exactly how to mix honey, cedar oil, and prayer into a potion of divine favor. Historians still argue whether these records were used politically, but some surviving tablets hint at patterns of movement, disease outbreaks, and even birth trends. You circle back toward the temple district and pass a classroom where apprentice scribes are learning to write. And what's on the tablet in front of them? A poem about Inanna seducing the heavens. Not a war epic, not a weather report, a sex poem. Because literacy wasn't born for filing complaints or balancing checkbooks. It was born to preserve the moans of gods and the instructions for ritual pleasure. In Mesopotamia, words had curves, sentences had hips, and stories weren't just told, they were performed. Body and voice in tandem. As the sun dips low, a quiet parade winds through the city. Priests, priestesses, and dancers. Some wear lion masks. Others hold branches shaped like vulvas and pomegranates. It's the festival of first fruits, where the city thanks Inanna for her abundant gifts. You watch as a priest and priestess exchange symbolic kisses on a raised platform. The crowd cheers softly. Not wild, not frenzied, reverent. And as the last drumbeat echoes down the alley, you realize this entire city, this entire system, is built on a single principle: desire is divine. And wherever it flows grain, water, power, it leaves behind the architecture of longing. You wake up to thunder not from the sky, but from a crowd. Hundreds of sandals slap against wet stone, voices rising in chaotic praise as drums pound like a racing heart. You push through the bodies, damp with sweat and perfume, until you reach the edge of the riverbank, and what you see makes your spine do that little electric curl. In the middle of a wide procession stands a carved wooden phallus, 2 meters high, lacquered and adorned with garlands of garlic and dyed sheep's wool. People are bowing to it, touching it, singing to it. Somewhere, a flute shrieks. Welcome to one of Mesopotamia's less publicized festivals, the celebration of divine erections. No joke. This isn't satire, this is sacred. Because in the logic of ancient city building, an erect penis isn't loot, it's life. It's a river that doesn't dry, a wall that doesn't fall, a harvest that doesn't rot in the sun. In other words, this is infrastructure worship. You glance at a child clapping along while his grandmother scatters date seeds near the river, whispering something that sounds like a prayer, but also like a shopping list. That's the tone here, joyful, practical, a little absurd. Because the flood's coming, and everyone knows it. The river swells each year, threatening to devour crops and drown homes. But to the Mesopotamians, this wasn't just water. This was the semen of Enki, god of fresh water and chaotic creativity. When the rivers burst their banks, it meant the gods were aroused. Literally. Their arousal fed the soil, filled the canals, flushed the toilets of the divine. And so, instead of fearing the flood, they celebrated it with songs, rituals, and sometimes, yes, public pageants featuring very enthusiastic wooden appendages. Let's step back for a moment and consider the myth of Enki and Ninhursag. Enki, lover of all things liquid and lewd, drinks from the sacred spring and becomes wildly aroused. He mates with one goddess, then another, and then another, each time creating a new part of the natural world. Rivers, crops, cattle, even salt marshes. Eventually, Ninhursag curses him with infertility, and he begins to wither. But the land begins to wither too. Only when she forgives him, symbolically restoring his virility, does the land bloom again. The message isn't subtle. Erections are ecosystemic. Male potency isn't just about babies. It's about bricks, canals, city walls. If the gods can't get it up, neither can civilization. Now for your required eyebrow raiser. In Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, there's mention of a ritual performed in Lagash where newly built canals were anointed with semen before being used. Not metaphorical semen, actual, human, ritually offered. The idea was to bind the canal with life energy, to marry it to the land. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or a local oddity. But either way, it tells you how seriously Mesopotamians took the connection between sexual vitality and civil engineering. You weren't just digging a ditch. You were consecrating a lifeline. You follow the procession as it winds into a central plaza, where priests reenact the myth of the flood. One plays Enki, another the chaotic goddess Tiamat, and together they battle, then embrace, then fall into a slow, dramatic kiss that ends in ritual water poured over the city gates. Children cheer, elders nod. You realize that this entire performance is doing double duty. It entertains, yes, but it also reaffirms the city's pact with the divine. If the gods are pleased, if the erotic energy flows, the walls hold. The granaries stay full, the enemies stay out. If not, well, better start building an ark. Here's a quirky detail most textbooks skip. Some Mesopotamian cities built flood barriers shaped like stretched out phalluses. Not in a cartoonish way, but in deliberate, symbolic form. The walls rose from the earth in long curved lines, meant to mirror the divine erection of the god Enlil, who according to one temple hymn, pierced the sky with his strength and calmed the flood with his rod. Again, you want to laugh, but then you remember, modern cities name buildings after billionaires. Is it really stranger to shape a levee like a god's private parts than to dedicate a stadium to a soda company? You step away from the crowd and duck into a small scribe's archive, cool and quiet. There, stacked in orderly rows, are clay tablets, wrapped in linen. You gently lift one, squinting at the cuneiform. It's a city budget report, boring at first glance until you notice a side note. 3 shekels allocated for the preparation of the king's loins before the festival of erection. This isn't euphemism. This is logistics. Ointments, incense, music, everything calculated to ensure the king could perform. Because his performance wasn't personal, it was geopolitical. His erection meant peace, plenty, and public morale. King, in these rituals, was less man and more metaphor. His arousal represented the state's strength. His orgasm, the climax of collective hope. Eleanor Herman describes one Babylonian ceremony where the king, after days of fasting and prayer, was anointed with 17 oils, kissed by 7 priestesses, then led to a special chamber where the act would be witnessed by senior scribes. Not watched voyeuristically, but observed legally as one might witness the signing of a treaty or the founding of a city. It was sex as civic architecture. Back in the plaza, the wooden phallus is now floating downriver, draped in lily and burning incense. Children throw flower petals after it, giggling. Elders close their eyes and whisper old blessings. And you realize this isn't about obscenity. It's about energy, metaphor, continuity. The ancient Mesopotamians looked at sex and didn't see shame. They saw scaffolding. They saw waterworks. They saw the long throbbing hum of survival. You follow the scent of frankincense and human heat to the foot of a towering structure that seems to pulse in the late evening haze. It's shaped like a stepped pyramid, massive, looming, half swallowed by sand and time. But when you step closer, it almost shivers with memory. This is no ordinary temple. This is a sacred brothel. And no, not sacred as in gilded chandeliers and lofty sermons, but sacred in the way that makes the earth hum, the way that stirs things deep in the marrow. Welcome to the moaning walls of Inanna, the grand temple of Inanna in Uruk. Legend claims the very bricks remember the cries of ecstasy offered up in ritual, and that those cries still echo through stone at night. You place your hand on the sun-warmed mudbrick and swear for a moment. You feel it like a whisper from 1,000 years ago pressed against your palm. Inside, the air is thick, not stale, more like slow. It clings to your skin. The corridors are lit by oil lamps that flicker like eyelids, revealing wall carvings so erotic they make modern art look prudish. A goddess spreads her arms and legs across an entire panel while priests chant nearby, faces calm, as if they're discussing crop rotations. You're in a room used not for pleasure, but for planetary alignment. Here, sex was orchestrated like a symphony. Everything mattered. The moon's phase, the incense blend, the rhythm of the drums, the order of touching. This wasn't intimacy. It was invocation. When bodies joined in this chamber, they were summoning power, asking for protection, blessing the city, not just physically, but spiritually, economically, architecturally. If the coupling was weak, the crops might wither. If the cries weren't full enough, the city's walls might crumble. It sounds dramatic, but when your entire civilization hinges on canals not cracking, you don't skimp on the moaning. You pass a tapestry embroidered in gold thread, showing Inanna dancing over a field of men, her dress a storm cloud, her breasts each cupping a crescent moon. According to one fringe theory, these sacred brothels were tuned to acoustics built to amplify certain frequencies, like the tone of a high priestess's climax. That's right, some scholars argue these temples were literal sound chambers, designed so that the ritual moans would reverberate into the foundation, creating sonic blessings that flowed into the earth. One damaged clay tablet even includes a sketch of a curved wall labeled Chamber of Divine Echo. Historians still argue whether this was architectural function or poetic flourish, but either way, you now understand why this place feels like it's breathing. You step into a side room lined with pillows and cooled by bowls of scented water. Here, high-ranking couples reenacted myths through performance, not just physical but dramatic. One common script? Inanna's descent into the underworld. The priestess would undress layer by layer, symbolizing the goddess stripping her power, while the priest begged the spirits below for her release. They would reunite in a final embrace, part passion, part parable, and in doing so, symbolically reopen the gates between life and death, ensuring the city's continued renewal. This wasn't voyeurism. It was civic insurance. Let's talk about one real woman, Shamhat from the Epic of Gilgamesh. She's labeled a temple prostitute, but that phrase doesn't capture her role. Shamhat is the emissary of civilization itself. She seduces the wild man Enkidu not with lust, but with patience, warmth, storytelling, and weeks, yes, weeks of lovemaking. Through her body, he becomes human, learns to speak, learns to eat bread, learns what it means to belong. So when modern scholars brush her aside as a courtesan, they miss the point. Shamhat is a nation-state in a dress. Her sex transforms a feral man into a citizen. What zoning laws and civil codes do today, she did with her thighs and her voice. And Enkidu, he never goes back to the wild. Not because he can't, but because civilization, once entered through intimacy, never releases its hold. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some temples, the bedding used during sacred rites was believed to carry divine charge. After ceremonies, the sheets were cut into strips and distributed among the poor or ill. They were used as talismans, healing cloths, even wound bindings. Imagine that a swatch of post-orgasm linen treated like a band-aid from the gods. There's a tablet fragment that records a midwife requesting a cloth from the moaning bed to help a woman in labor. Was it symbolic? Maybe. Was it effective? Maybe not. But belief has a way of making even the strangest rituals stick. Outside the temple, the night is heavy with stars, and the city buzzes softly, like a body after breathless touch. You hear the distant sound of flutes again, and somewhere far off, a laugh long loose, the kind that only comes from faith and satisfaction. The moaning walls stand behind you, silent now, but not forgotten. And you? You've just walked through the blueprint of a society that never separated the sacred from the sensual, that believed every whispered name of a lover could be another. Name for the divine dot, you find yourself in the city's southern quarter now, where the air grows drier, sharper laced with the crackle of early morning markets, and the sticky sweetness of dates frying in sesame oil. But there's another rhythm. Beneath the commerce, quieter yet older than money, the rhythm of ritual. You pause near a wide plaza where merchants have just begun to set up stalls, stacked jars of lentils, wheels of goat cheese, glinting copper trinkets, and in the center, right between a barley vendor and a loom seller, stands a raised platform with a carved symbol that looks suspiciously like intertwined lovers. This, you realize, is the city's ritual square. Where you see trade, they see fertility. Where you see a queue of bored shoppers, they see the living reenactment of divine union. And right on schedule, as the sun glints gold over mudbrick rooftops, the ritual begins. A young woman steps onto the platform, her dress dyed deep indigo and patterned with pomegranate blossoms. She chants a hymn to Inanna, hips swaying not seductively, but deliberately, as if each movement pulls invisible threads that hold the city together. A man joins her, clad in sheepskin, his forehead marked with ash. They circle each other. They don't touch, not yet. They recite lines from a love poem older than paper, their voices low, timed like breath. The crowd doesn't cheer. They bow their heads. This is a fertility rite, not for babies, necessarily, but for balance, abundance, safety. And after a few slow turns, the couple departs. Ritual done. Market begins. Chickpeas are sold. Silver changes hands. Life resumes. Now here's where it gets delicious. In Mesopotamia, sex wasn't confined to temples or palaces. It was baked into the rhythm of the economy. Certain marketplaces timed their busiest sales with lunar cycles associated with Inanna's influence. Traders wore amulets shaped like vulvas and phalluses, not as dirty jokes, but as literal good. Luck charms. Even contracts often included sexual blessings, phrases like, "May your barley be as firm as your bridegroom's resolve," or "May your cargo flow like the goddess's desire." You laugh, but that grain shipment just got consecrated by metaphor. You step into a covered alley lined with clay tablet sellers. One offers you a smoothed piece inscribed with what looks like poetry. You read, "When the moon opens her thighs, the earth drinks, When Inanna sighs, the oxen rise. It's a planting calendar, disguised as erotic verse. Farmers would consult these before sowing, because the connection between pleasure and production wasn't symbolic, it was procedural. They believed sexual energy moved through the soil, through water channels, through the grain. A land without erotic ritual was a land destined for drought. Here's a fun contradiction historians love to chew on. In a society that prized sacred sexual ritual, adultery outside of those rituals was sometimes punished harshly. But the definition of adultery was slippery. If a married woman visited a temple for a fertility rite, that wasn't adultery, it was duty. If a man lay with a priestess during a sanctioned ceremony, that wasn't cheating, it was participation. But if either broke rank for private pleasure, outside sacred bounds, they could be fined, whipped, or even publicly shamed. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced evenly, or if they mostly targeted the lower classes. Either way, the takeaway's clear. Sex wasn't taboo. It was regulated, supervised, sacralized. Passion wasn't forbidden, it was licensed. Let's talk about the concept of the sacred contract. In many Mesopotamian cities, marriage. Contracts weren't just about dowries or inheritance. They included ritual clauses. Some promised annual reenactments of the sacred marriage rite. Others bound couples to recite divine verses during intimacy. One surviving contract from Nippur includes a clause stating that if the husband fails to sing the praises of the goddess upon the threshold of his wife, she may return to her mother's house without penalty. Translation: if you forget the pillow poetry, you lose the house. That's policy, baby. You head toward the grain exchange, a long courtyard stacked high with sacks of barley, millet, and emmer wheat. It smells like sweat, sun-baked canvas, and hope. And etched into the exchange's stone gate is another erotic inscription. Let the seed flow. Let the field open. Let the city bloom. You see now what they meant by city-building magic. It wasn't just bricklaying and water rooting. It was rhythm, metaphor, touch. The marketplace, the bedroom, the altar, they weren't separate stages. They were all part of the same dance. Now for your sex story from the archives. In the history of sexuality, Michel Foucault muses on a rare Babylonian rite in which couples engaged in reciprocal offering in public squares during harvest festivals. Participants weren't chosen at random. They were elected, respected, viewed almost as civic heroes. Their lovemaking wasn't wild or private. It was choreographed like a ritual handshake between the heavens and the harvest. And after, they were bathed, crowned with wreaths, and paraded through the city as bringers of bounty. Imagine that. An orgasm earning you applause, fruit baskets, and a discount on lentils for life. You leave the square just as the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows over sandstone doorways. A child hands you a fig and recites, "The goddess smiled last night. Today, the grain will rise." And somehow, in this bizarre, sensual, highly organized world, it all makes sense. The city pulses with ritual, with laughter, with moans long folded into the mortar. Here, sex isn't behind closed doors. It's folded into contracts, stitched into harvest songs, and sold alongside lentils by old women who remember the rites by heart. You stand at the mouth of the city gate just as a funeral procession slips past mourners in linen robes, carrying a wooden bier draped with lily, the dead wrapped like a sleeping child. But what catches your eye isn't the solemnity. It's the architecture. The city gate arches wide and low, and on either side, carved in high relief, are two unmistakably detailed female figures, legs parted, hips wide, hands cradling swollen bellies. And then it hits you. The gate is a womb. Not a metaphor, not a literary device, a literal design. You didn't walk through a wall, you were born into the city. Every time you enter or leave, you pass through the body of a goddess. Welcome. to the part of Mesopotamia where cities are built not just by sex, but as sex, where birth, boundary, and bureaucracy all pass through the same symbolic canal. You begin to notice it everywhere. Doorways shaped like inverted triangles, courtyards that mimic the layout of a uterus, drainage systems described in temple texts as purification channels. Even the public bathhouses follow the logic of reproduction: cool water to cleanse, warm basins to incubate, narrow exits to release. The entire urban plan feels like something sketched from inside a womb, not a war tent. And it makes sense. In a world obsessed with fertility, nothing was more sacred than the female body. It was the original city, self-repairing, self-sustaining, capable of pain, memory, protection. The temple wasn't separate from the street, and the street wasn't separate from the body. They were all one breathing, birthing organism. Let's zoom in on the birthing chamber, a space few modern museums talk about, yet central to civic life. In elite Mesopotamian households, these chambers were often built into the foundations of the home, cool and dark, with soot-blackened ceilings and walls etched with protective glyphs. Women gave birth in squatting positions, supported by midwives and priestesses, under the watch of small clay statues meant to guard the passage between worlds. And here's the curious part. Many of these statues weren't of babies. They were of gates, vulvas, or entire miniature cities. The act of childbirth wasn't just making a person, it was maintaining civilization. One baby out of the womb meant one more citizen under the law. One more body to work, worship, and remember. Now for your nightly dose of historical eyebrow raising. In The Erotic Spirit Through History, Peter Webb describes a temple ritual in Eridu where pregnant women would press their bellies to sacred stones, said to vibrate with divine energy. These stones, carved in the shape of uterine spirals, were believed to guarantee smooth labor and wise offspring. One surviving hymn describes Inanna wrapping the newborn in the fabric of law, the silk of civic order. Imagine that, your birth not just as a biological event, but as a spiritual initiation into bureaucracy. As you wander through a residential district, you notice the pattern continues. Even the layout of homes mimics the female form: public rooms near the entrance, the legs, private quarters deeper in the belly, and shrines or altars in the back, often where a woman would give birth, nurse, or grieve. Some houses had birth corners marked by red paint and small bowls of date wine, always refreshed. Scholars argue whether this design was deliberate urban planning or emergent tradition, but either way, it blurs the line between architecture and anatomy. Let's talk politics for a moment, because this isn't just poetry and paint. The womb as city metaphor had legal weight. In several surviving texts, kings refer to themselves as born of the gate, delivered through stone thighs, or suckled by the city. These weren't metaphors of inheritance. They were claims to divine right, to be born through. The city's symbolic womb meant legitimacy. It meant your rule was not just political, but anatomical. And the inverse was true too. Cities that fell in war were said to have been torn in childbirth, their gates spilling blood, their walls split like a cursed womb. These were not casual metaphors. These were operating instructions for how to build, break, and rebuild an empire. Now for your nightly sex story. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman references a mythic king of Lagash who demanded to be delivered once more before every major military campaign. The ritual involved him crawling through a sacred gate shaped like a vulva, yes, full on, carved lips and all, while priestesses chanted birthing songs. He emerged on the other side, naked and oiled to the roar of warriors. The belief was that only those reborn by the city could defend it. Absurd? Maybe. But that king won 9 consecutive campaigns and expanded Lagash's borders threefold. You tell me. And here's your quirky fringe theory. One group of scholars believes Mesopotamian maps weren't symbolic at all, they were anatomical. That the oldest urban layouts found etched on clay tablets were actually based on cross-sections of the womb, the pelvis, even the menstrual cycle. They argue that everything from festival calendars to irrigation patterns mimicked biological flows. Historians still debate this hotly, but the overlaps are compelling. And honestly, once you've walked through a gate shaped like a goddess's hips, it's hard to look at a street map the same way again. The sun sets, casting long shadows from the gate's wide flanks. Children race through it, laughing, unaware of its meaning but wrapped in its symbolism all the same. You sit on a worn stone bench and watch as the last light slides down the vulva carvings, touching each detail like a whispered goodbye. In this city, every street is a scar from some ancient birth. Every alley holds a memory of someone being pulled, gasping, into existence, of someone becoming real. And you're just now starting to realize that maybe you've been inside the goddess this whole time. You slip into the palace quarter under the veil of twilight, where the air smells like rosewater, grilled lamb, and the kind of secrets only marble walls can keep. The streets are quieter here, muffled by layers of silk and power. No marketplaces, no noisy rituals, just guards with polished spears and eunuchs gliding like ghosts between shadowed doorways. But behind one of those doors, just past a lattice screen carved with birds mid-flight, a very different kind of ceremony unfolds. A king young, heavily perfumed, draped in lapis and lion skins lies sprawled on a daybed. Around him, 6 women move like smoke, each representing one of Inanna's sacred aspects: lust, chaos, mercy, war, order, and mystery. This isn't a party. It's governance. Because here in Mesopotamia, if you want to rule a city, you better prove you can rule the bedchamber first. The logic is both simple and seductive. The gods govern through desire. So must the king. His virility isn't a private affair. It's policy. Every moan he coaxes, every kiss he commands, becomes symbolic proof that he can manage people, land, and law. A weak lover is a weak ruler. And don't think it's all for show. These rituals are recorded, evaluated, whispered about in corridors. Some royal scribes even kept monthly logs, measuring not just fertility, but satisfaction. One surviving clay note from a palace scribe reads, "The king favored mystery tonight." Her voice rose 3 times. Her limbs trembled. That's right. Orgasm audits. You trail behind the curtain into the royal harem, a sprawling garden of silks, fountains, and perfumed air thick enough to eat. Contrary to Hollywood's sweaty imagination, this is not a den of chaos. It's an institution. The concubines are not passive playthings. They're diplomats, strategists, and in many cases, priestesses trained to channel the divine. Each has a role. One might oversee temple donations. Another manages grain records. A third whispers to generals. Their sex with the king, sacred repetition. Each coupling reenacts a facet of divine creation. To lie with lust is to stir the flood. 2. Lie with order is to bind law to clay. It's not just pleasure, it's civic choreography. Let's talk power moves. Inanna, the goddess whom kings hope to embody or marry through ritual, is not the soft, submissive figure later religions preferred. She is fierce, demanding, unpredictable. And any king who hopes to rule under her protection better keep up. One myth describes her storming heaven because a lover failed to satisfy her. She tears down stars, breaks mountains, curses entire river systems until she is properly and publicly pleased. The moral? Ignore the goddess's pleasure at your peril. For Mesopotamian kings, that translated into a literal commandment. Make love like your throne depends on it, because it does. Now for your scholarly debate of the night. Historians still argue whether the king's sacred sex rituals were performed in public or behind palace doors. Some texts suggest open-air platforms, complete with choirs, incense, and scribes. Others hint at secretive chambers beneath the ziggurat, guarded by oaths and blood. A few fringe theories even claim a dual performance, one public, one private, where the king's stand-in performed above, while the actual rite happened below. Either way, the outcome mattered: reign, health, trade, even border security. The king's sexual success or failure was interpreted as an omen. One tablet recounts a season of drought following a cold ceremony. Translation: the king couldn't perform. The land followed suit. Let's not forget the women. These priestess concubines weren't just partners. They were interpreters of the goddess. Their satisfaction was divine approval. Their disappointment could curse a dynasty. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman tells of a queen priestess who refused the sacred rite after a dream, in which Inanna turned her face away. The resulting famine lasted 2 years. Whether correlation or coincidence, the court believed it. She was reinstated only after a full month of ritual bathing, poetry recitation, and a dramatic plea from the king naked and kneeling in the temple courtyard. You pass a corridor where paintings stretch along the wall frescoes of King's Inn. Various stages of passion and power, not erotica, but state narrative. Each lover a god, each kiss a contract. One image shows a king weeping into the arms of a concubine, dressed as chaos. Below, an inscription: "In surrender, he brought peace." It's a reminder that Mesopotamian masculinity wasn't all chest beating. Vulnerability was power too, if expressed correctly ritually, erotically. And here's your quirky tidbit. One Babylonian palace kept a rotating archive of moan recordings. Not sound files, of course, but poetic transcriptions of priestesses' vocalizations, categorized by tone, rhythm, and presumed effect on weather. One particularly popular chant was believed to summon wind. Another was used during military campaigns. The belief was that these sounds, once performed during ritual sex, could be mimicked later to bring divine favor. Oral architecture, built from breath. The stars shine cold above the palace as you step outside. And you wonder how much of this was faith, how much was politics, how much was just desire, disguised as necessity. But here in Mesopotamia, there's no clean division. The ruler's bed is the city's spine. His passion, its pulse, and the priestess at his side. She's not just a lover. She's the hinge between heaven and tax code. Between moan and mandate, you wander out of the palace quarter and into a quieter side of the city. Less marble, more mudbrick, fewer scribes, more shepherds. But don't let the simplicity fool you. Even here, in these worn courtyards and cracked alleys, sex still hums under everything, like an old river, less glamorous now maybe, but no less powerful. You pass a woman grinding grain while singing a tune that sounds suspiciously like a love spell. A child watches two beetles wrestle and shouts, "That one's Inanna." Laughter ripples through the street, but you can tell they mean it. Sex isn't just ceremony here. It's language, it's math, it's city planning. And in this neighborhood, it shows up in the most unexpected places, like land surveys or property laws, or the kinds of contracts that begin with "May your lips be sweet as honey" when you dispute this fence line. You duck into a scribe's den, not the grand kind with golden seals, but a dusty backroom lined with shelves and the must of old clay. The scribe, gray-bearded and barefooted, hands you a tablet with a grin. It's a love spell, yes, but the lines also describe the exact dimensions of a field, the location of an irrigation ditch, and 3 witnesses who apparently watched the whole flirtation unfold. The couple's intimacy, it turns out, was used to mark a legal boundary. Their kisses became coordinates. Their sighs, the deed. It's not isolated either. Across Mesopotamian cities, scholars have found dozens of tablets where erotic language is fused with legal infrastructure. "May my seed water the canal beside your orchard," one reads. Another, "If your gaze favors me, let us share this." Courtyard until the third harvest moon. Romantic, sure, but also legally binding. That's city-building magic. The contract and the caress are one. Let's not forget the spells. Oh, the spells. Some were sweet, gentle invocations whispered into the night. May his hand linger as the rain lingers on wheat. Others? Less subtle. One clay tablet from Kish includes a recipe for a potion to soften the hips and open the heart of a distant lover. The ingredients? Crushed rose petals, river mud, goat milk, and the ashes of a comb. Whether it worked or not, we'll never know, but someone believed it. Someone ground those petals, whispered those lines, and hoped the gods were paying attention. And while historians still debate whether these spells were treated as superstition or sacred science, the sheer volume of surviving examples tells you everything you need to know. Love was worth documenting. And city life? It ran on hope as much as grain. And now for your daily eyebrow raiser, courtesy of Michel Foucault's musings on desire and regulation. He notes that Mesopotamian cities often regulated sexual activity, not through shame, but through spatial logic. Want a couple during a festival? Fine, there's a designated field, lined with poppies, maintained by the temple. Want to separate from your spouse? Do it during the waxing moon, so the cycle reflects renewal. Even prostitutes were assigned specific quarters, not to hide them, but to honor them. In fact, some cities issued state tokens, small clay discs that could be exchanged for the services of a temple prostitute during sacred festivals. These weren't hush-hush bribes. They were receipts, tracked, taxed, celebrated. You step into a public square where disputes are being settled, not by fists, but by poetry. Two men argue over a water channel, and instead of yelling, they recite verses. Each tries to outrhyme the other while referencing old love stories to prove their point. It's absurd, it's theatrical, and yet it works. The elders watching nod along, judging not just the argument, but the style. You realize you're watching the vestiges of a world where language was law, and sex was its sharpest dialect. Because in Mesopotamia, a strong metaphor could win you a field. A well-placed compliment could redirect a canal. Now for a real story. Pulled from Eleanor Herman's writings. There's a legend of a landowner named Iltani who seduced her neighbor not with wine or perfume, but with math. She allegedly carved a love letter into a tablet that doubled as a crop rotation chart. On one side, calculations. On the other, poetry. Let your oxen rest in my furrows. Let our grains rise together. The man accepted. Their land was joined. Their bodies followed, and when she passed, he buried her beneath the boundary stone they had once argued over. Historians aren't sure if the story's true, but the tablet exists, and it's beautiful. The city, once. Again, shaped by longing. You find yourself back near the river, where young scribes are copying tablet after tablet, most with mixtures of erotic poetry and tax records. One reads, "Let the moon witness our union. Let my sheep graze your valley." Another simply says, "I loved you through 2 harvests. I now claim the orchard." You realize they weren't writing love letters. They were writing maps. Emotional. Cartography. Desire as deed. Affection as infrastructure. And your quirky tidbit of the night? Some clay tablets were molded in the shape of vulvas or phalluses, not as decoration, but as categorization. Love spells in vulva shapes. Dispute records. In phallic forms. A kind of filing system, but more anatomically intuitive. Imagine a city hall desk cluttered with clay genitalia, each representing a legal request, a poem, a boundary, a hope. The stars begin to blink above you. The city quiets. Somewhere nearby, a couple whispers blessings over a shared cup. The language they use is half flirtation, half legal clause. And you realize, here in Mesopotamia, intimacy was never just between 2 bodies. It was between body and land, breath and brick, sigh, and law. Every kiss left a footprint. Every moan marked a map. You stand on a rooftop now, barefoot on sun-warmed clay, as the last haze of twilight spills across the ziggurat like melted copper. From here, the city feels like a single living thing, breathing, groaning, glittering in places, cracked in others. Every rooftop a heartbeat, every alleyway a memory. You've followed its curves, its pulses, its sacred games of touch and transaction. But now comes the part no one likes to admit. Even magic grows tired. Even sex-stained empires forget how to moan. Down below, the temples still burn their incense. The priestesses still recite their hymns. But the crowds are thinner. The moaning walls don't echo like they used to. The king is aging, and the crops aren't listening anymore. And yet, the rituals continue like muscle memory in a dying body. Beautiful and haunting, and a little bit hollow. You walk past a group of boys playing with wooden swords in the dirt. Their game half war, half wedding, chanting lines they don't understand. Let my hand till your field, one shouts. Let my gate receive your ox, they laugh. Their elders don't stop them. They don't need to. The words are still sacred, even if their meaning has faded. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? That something so potent, so sweaty and divine, could slowly become costume and choreography. What once stirred rivers and gods now stirs only nostalgia. The city still believes in sex, but mostly in memory. You pass a crumbling bathhouse, half buried in sand. The door is warped, the fountains dry. But on one remaining wall, the image of Inanna remains, her hips wide, her eyes watching. You realize this was once a place where women gathered to bathe before sacred rites, to anoint their skin with myrrh, and ask the goddess for passion, for grain, for safety. Now it's just silence and dust. But as you linger, you think you hear something, a low sigh, a song, maybe just the wind. But it's enough to make your skin prickle. Because places like this don't die easily. They just sleep. Let's talk about collapse. When Mesopotamian cities began to fall under drought, invasion, or their own weight, it wasn't the walls that crumbled first. It was the faith and the rituals. The king missed a ceremony. The priestess refused a rite. The sacred marriage was delayed, and the people noticed. Without the moans, the myths began to dry. The temples lost their fire. The gods grew quiet, trade slowed. Sex, once the heartbeat of the city, became a whisper. The stories remained, but they no longer rang. True, they became what's that word? Quaint. Now for your final sex story. In a faded tablet found near the ruins of Nippur, there's a tale of a last priestess, unnamed, likely forgotten, who performed the sacred marriage alone after the city fell. No king, no witnesses. Just her, draped in ritual linen, walking barefoot to the empty ziggurat, reciting the ancient lines. Let the gate receive me, she says. Let the field tremble. She anoints herself. She moans into the wind. And as the story goes, the rains came that night. A trickle, then a flood. Was it real? Historians still argue. But the point is, someone wrote it down. Someone carved that moment into clay. Because even as the bricks fell, someone still believed in the Mondat. And here's your last quirky tidbit. In the ruins of Uruk, archaeologists found a cracked statue of a phallus, once displayed proudly in a temple, now toppled and half buried. But inside the base, they discovered a tiny scroll of copper etched with a blessing. Let this never rust, though all else fades. Let this stand when kings fall. The statue crumbled. But the scroll survived. A little metal prayer in a world of dust. The stars wheel slowly above you now, endless and ancient. The wind carries the faintest scent of rosewater, or maybe just the memory of it. You realize the real magic wasn't in the sex itself. It was in the belief that sex could build. A city could hold its walls, feed its people, bind heaven to mud. That every moan was mortar, every kiss a cornerstone. It's almost unbearably romantic. And also heartbreakingly human. You close your eyes and let it all settle. The sound of drums, the hymns, the soft sighs in sacred chambers, the clink of tokens exchanged for blessings, the lovers arguing over canals, the priestess alone on the ziggurat steps. You've walked through a civilization that saw no line between body and brick, between pleasure and planning. And now, even in ruin, it breathes, quietly, like an old lover whispering, "I remember you." So now, as the city dims behind your eyelids, let your breath slow with the rhythm of ancient hymns, soft and circular. Picture the flickering oil lamps casting warmth on worn stone, the way the moaning walls once held whole seasons between their sighs. You're not walking anymore, you're floating, as if carried by a river thick with memories, a flood of forgotten touches and whispered vows. Let the distant chants fade like candle smoke. Let the scent of rose oil and grain slip from your thoughts. Whatever cities you carry, whatever ruins you wander, know they once pulsed with laughter, with longing, with bodies learning the language of earth and sky. And in this gentle silence now, that history wraps around you like linen sheets. Left warm from love, you are safe, you are home. You are ancient, drift easy, dream deep, end of script. Sweet dreams.